Welcome, everybody. Many of you know that I've developed an approach here in Second Life based on lifelong work as an artist, educator, and psychologist, which I call symbolic modeling, or SymMod for short. And today we're going to look at how we can use symbols for a life integration process as we age. Besides being a great brain exercise, this can clarify your legacy, your accomplishments, the choices you've made, the turning points in your life, the understanding that others can have about your life, the tasks you've accomplished, uplifting experiences that might still be awaiting you, and maybe some surprises. So the goal of this workshop is to introduce you to some ways that you can get going on your own life integration project, not to produce a finished product. It would be impossible. So mostly we hope that you have fun with this and that you continue to work on this as a part of your healthful aging toolkit. So first thing I want to do is to introduce you to one that I did for my 80th birthday, which was 8 years ago. And then we'll be leading you through a process in which you can begin to do an integration of your own. This is my tree of life. A large one of these hangs in my house, so friends and family who visit can look it over, ask questions or whatever. This was a process that spanned months of thinking, of gathering materials from my files, remembering stuff. But when I actually did the tree, it was all at once because I'd done a lot of the preparation stuff. So what you can see here, this is a whole metaphor for my life. So we start with what were my roots. And my roots, without going into detail, were my genetic inheritance from my family and my early childhood experiences. These were all roots that produced the trunk, which is like my foundation. All these schools I went to, the camp experiences I had, postgraduate work, and travel. And so that became like a foundation. Some of it was time sensitive, some ran through my life. And then I branched out, so that's the next metaphor. So you can see my central branch, which I call creative process. That's my driving engine in my life and work. And then the others, I've got several other branches. You see organization and training development, therapies and tools, family and friends, and community building. And then for each one of these, there are things that grow from that, which are the leaves. So the leaves become the metaphor or examples of all the different kinds of projects that I've done in my life. And you can see under community building on the left, you can see Second Life is a quite prominent leaf there. So that gives you an idea of a symbolic model for a life integration. Now, over here, I have a blank one. And you're also welcome to make up your own, but I'm going to talk a little bit about all of these. So I put my tree form here, if you like that. But here are a couple of other different kinds of trees. And another one might appeal to you more. And they branch out differently. They have different kinds of leaves. Then there are some, here's a flower or a lotus. Now some of you will think consecutively and sequentially, and others will think about highlights. The flower might be a good one for you simply to jot down highlights of your life in each of the petals. So that's a whole other way. If you see the spiral up on top there, so that would start with your birth in the center, and then spiral out, and then it would be like a timeline where you could make little notes about things that occurred in your timeline right up to the present time. The one above the flower, you see there are 3 different spirals. Maybe you have had a life that has had distinctly different parts to it. So that might be a symbol that you could use for that, where you describe the movement of those different parts of your life. And over here, we have a river. This is another metaphor that you might have felt like you were sailing through life, and then you get off on different trajectories and different branches of the river, and then maybe you come back to what your main branch is. There are a lot of different ways you can do that. Up above, you see a road. For some of you, the construction of a road feels better than a river that's more meandering. Depending on how your brain is organized and what feels like the best representation of the way your life has worked. Next to it is a staircase. That's for people who think about what are the different steps, metaphorically, that I've taken to move through my life and get to where I am now. And so you might put little notes on the landing of each step and then what you had to do to climb the step. And then over here, this is an example of an abstraction. And that just loops around. If you like to play with that, if you're a more artistic type, I start out as a spiral and then I kind of loop around. And oh yes, these memories belong in this loop, and then these memories go to this loop, and so on, up to the top. Now the other possibility you have is to create a symbol that feels more like you. Maybe yours would feel more like hills and valleys. Maybe yours would feel like a pool out of which came different forms of life. Maybe it could be a forest, different ways that you had to go through the woods to get to where you were going, and so on. So there are a lot of different things that you could play around with. You don't necessarily have to stick to just one type. It's simply to stimulate your thinking about, in my aging years, when I look back at my life, what has my journey been like? So now take a look and make a choice of one symbolic model just to play with today. It may not be the one that you develop more fully later, but just one that captures your attention right now. You will not finish it, but you can make a start. And then I'm just going to give you some time to think about your life journey, your trajectory, how you're organized to think about it. I'll remind you, some will think about it in a sequential way from birth up to now. Others will think about different important events that have occurred at different times in your life where you don't necessarily have a sequence. There are all kinds of ways of doing this. So I'm going to give you maybe 10 minutes now to just work on this on your own. And particularly, I want you to keep track of your process, of what you're thinking, of your feelings, of the choices you're making, of different memories that come up. And when we share later, it'll be about the process, not so much about the content of what you've come up with. So keep track of that process. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go around, I'm going to ask you to say just a little bit about your process. Like, how was that for you? Like both the choosing of the symbol and your experience starting to work on it. You don't need to share the actual content. What we're focusing on now is the process. You're up first.
It was surprisingly easy for me to come up with an image to work with. And I liked the idea about the pools. But for me, I chose basically a really tall waterfall that starts out small and hits a number of pools on the way down. It became large and ended up in the communal soup, you know. because that's kind of how I feel. That's always resonated with me, is water seeking its lowest level, which sort of encapsulates my somewhat passive approach to life. And so I found that really helpful. So I started out with grade school and hit a pool and went to high school and hit a pool, the various big changes that happened in my life. I'm either the water or like a little floaty diving down between them. One side of the fall is kind of what I've learned on the way.
How did it work for you, choosing the waterfall? Would you want to try also some other symbol at another time, or does that one feel really right for what you want to record?
Actually, it feels really right. It gave me room on one side for one stream of development, and then the other side for a more outer social stream development, so that I think I can really work with that.
Okay, let's go on to take a minute, just your process.
I like the trees to use in the symbolic modeling of thinking here, and with leaves. I don't feel like I have any accomplishments, so I looked at it from a perspective of where I have interests. Things that have enriched my life, and dividing the different branches into where I would like to work with things that would enrich my life. Because I always look at accomplishments as comparisons or endpoints. I'd like to look at it as more just like interests and things like that. So I thought about the tree with the 3 branches, and I thought, no, that's still too confined. And I like the tree with the different leaves. And then what I can do is I can color the leaves differently. So these are my aspirations, what I'd like to try. That way it doesn't seem like it has to be an accomplishment. It could be an exploration.
Okay, that's a lovely example of just thinking creatively about this basic exercise and finding something that's right for you. So in your case, it's based on enrichments and interests and things that you might like to try and so on. Perfect, perfect. For every person, it's going to be different. That's why I want you to hear each other, because when people share their process, we all benefit from it. We all get ideas. And particularly in our aging process, there are fountains of possibilities still open to us that when we share in a relational kind of way, send us off into other possible directions. So let's keep going. Did you do this?
Yes, I actually did, but I have a very short observation to make. I used the river, but I don't relate to the idea of floating along the river. It was more swimming, and then sometimes going with the flow and going through different stages of my life, or going in different directions, coming back or circling around, and having other branches flow into as well as me going out. And sometimes I would be going with the flow, you might say, and other times I'd be swimming, as a friend of mine described it, pushing the river when it's going wrong. And that's basically, I'm having fun with that.
That's great, adding that to the pot. I mean, I'm sure that it will stimulate other people's thinking as well. Thank you.
I tend to look at time in a linear fashion, and I'm also a fan of railways, and this immediately gave me the idea that looking at my life as a train journey. Sometimes I come to a minor junction and I go one way, and something else goes the other way, and it doesn't really matter, and I don't know where it's going. On other occasions, I come to a large station where I change trains, and that is when there is a fundamental change in work where I live, things like that, and relationships. When I change trains when there is something major going on, sometimes I know what would happen to the train that I got off of. Other times I just don't. Okay? That's me.
It's a terrific image. So that adds another one to our pot. Fantastic. Okay.
So I thought about the spirals as a template,
but it became confusing in my mind in like a matter of seconds. You know, you have an image of the lotus up there, and the lotus for me I gravitate to. It has deep spiritual and symbolic significance to me. And so in terms of how I would map my life out or my experiences out on that, I thought about the mud that the lotus grows from as really being the challenges and the foundation of my life. At least I see experiences coming from the challenges and the effort that we make and what have you. And then the water around that buoys it up as my interaction with the world around me, my experiences of the world around me. And then the flowers, my accomplishments and personal experiences. That's a rough idea. I had played with different images. I kept coming back to the lotus, which is why I wound up choosing it.
Yeah, and just keep playing with it. It might even end up looking a little bit different from this lotus. It might be a couple of different lotuses, who knows? But I appreciate the clarity of describing your process, because we could really see that you started thinking about the spiral and realized that it did not work for you, and that it was confusing, and that the lotus worked better. So, thank you.
Hello. I thought about a desert at first, or perhaps looking through fog, because I've spent most of my life just not really knowing who I was, what I was, where I should be. And in the end, I've come up with a bubble that I'm inside of. That's how I felt, really, most of my life, until recently. It sort of bumps into things, and then the bubble travels on to someplace else. And I get an idea that maybe that's where I am, where I belong.
That's really interesting. You could play with that. You could have a whole bunch of different bubble balloons, and each one could be some different aspect of your life, your relationships, your education, and that might help give you some kind of structure for looking back at your life. Okay.
My last life, so to speak, I was a department head in a computer department, and one of the other department heads was a graphic artist department head, and he told me this about visual note-taking. My latest journal, called 70s and Beyond, is not a conventional journal. It just tries to describe as well as I can about what's going on, but it's got a lot of visuals in it, and sometimes the visuals will spark a memory. I just remembered somebody's name from the 60s that I'd forgotten for a long time. And I'd put a little arrow over to the other page and draw a little something and start writing about it. So it's not linear in any fashion. And that's what I was kind of thinking.
Keeping a visual journal, that's a wonderful way to collect stuff that's going on in your life. It might still be an interesting exercise for you to use some kind of graphic where you could encapsulate the trajectory or the picture of your life that you could actually share with others at some point. But I like that whole idea of a visual journal. I'm going to go on now to the tree as a metaphor, yes? What a great idea, tree houses. Branches represented more social types of experiences, whereas the tree houses contain more solo ones in the form of open-air ponds on the treehouse decks. Wow. A huge treehouse containing many ponds. Wow. Can you say a little bit about what the process was like for you? Confused at first, but finally something emerged. Excellent. That will be so much fun to see later. All right, so now is going to be putting her notes in the chat. She was drawn to the tree first because she tends to be quite straightforward, but then saw the spiral and thought that was it. And while I was developing it, it surprised me to realize how some things that I thought were not that important stood out, and maybe others that I thought had left an imprint in me, I just skipped and only realized much later. That's a terrific insight. It was a mixture of achievements, painful moments, happy moments, material things I got, maybe because I value the effort it took me to get them. I don't know. Okay. It looks like you're really mapping out a lot of stuff. And as you go through this process, it's going to change. That's why I asked you to have a pencil with an eraser, because there'll be some things that you put in that you might want to take out, or you might want to add different pieces to it. If you think of it as a legacy map, that is, in your aging process, how can you look back at a very long or complicated life, and what do you pay attention to, and what would you like other people to pay attention to? I'm thinking that in my butterfly gallery, I would like to have an exhibit of the things that you come up with about your legacy or looking back as a person of age. I think it would be fun to have an exhibit for people who are willing to submit your finished symbol, and later on we'll have an exhibit. Now we're going to go on to the second part of this. So I want to show you another process related to the slides we provided, and some of you might want to work with builds that represent different aspects of the life also. So what I'm going to suggest is that you take a fresh piece of drawing paper now and make a large circle and divide it into 3 parts. It's like a pie with 3 pieces. And then on the outside of the circle, label the first segment physical, the second segment emotional, and the third segment intellectual creative. And then each slide has questions to help you think about these aspects of you, and you can fill in some responses in each segment of the pie. So here are the physical questions. How well are you caring for the only body you've got? How much do you love and accept your body? And what do you do to keep yourself healthy? And this can include anything here at Whole Brain Health or in Second Life that you do, as well as in your actual physical life. All right, so those are the physical ones. Emotional. Do you feel lovingly connected to the people in your life, or do you feel isolated, resistant, or sullen most of the time? Are your relations with others flowing, static, or charged? Do you get hooked and identify with your misery? Can you get over it fairly quickly? Do you feel whole and at peace within yourself and others? Now, these are sort of prompting questions, but you can actually take off on them and see what occurs to you as you try to make sense of the responses in your own way, in your own life. Now, the intellectual creative questions. How much of your mind's capacity are you using? How much playing, inventing, imagining do you do? And that's really what we're doing today. Are you in a rut at work, or are you extending your boundaries? And even for those of you who are totally retired, you can think of, what is your work now? What are your objectives? What are the things that you're trying to do in your life right now to give it purpose and meaning? Are you extending your boundaries, or are you working within a scope that has great meaning for you that you want to stay focused on? What tires you out in terms of thinking about stuff or trying to create stuff? So those questions kind of just give you some prompts. So take a minute and just write down some responses to those questions. Any of these can be also worked with symbolically. For instance, when I have people do symbolic builds, I might ask them or you to focus on a current feeling state, physical, emotional, however, and then to make a symbolic representation of it with the building tools that are here in this world. when I actually do my symbolic modeling workshops, I lead people or guide them through ways of working with their objects that help them find meaning through it. For now, you can just jot down a few things in each of these 3 pie pieces. I'm not going to ask you to reveal the content of what you've written, but comment on this process of making something that you can actually visually see and then filling in this kind of information and how that might help you in moving forward in thinking about, oh, what do I want to pay more attention to here? You might find, for instance, that some of these segments are taken care of very well by you, are very easy for you, and others not so much, are a challenge. For instance, I know how much exercise is important for me, and I do stretching kinds of things for my upper and lower body, but I don't get enough aerobic exercise. I don't take the time sometimes to get out there and walk when I'm on the screen doing things that are fascinating me. So that is a challenge for me, and I'm working on it. So that's something that I would write in the physical part of my pie. All right, so just in the few minutes that we have left for the formal discussion, let me just hear what some of your thoughts are about this process as a way of kind of symbolically representing different aspects of your being. It's a good way to identify specifics in 3 important areas of my personal life, okay?
I like the pie visual because I tend to compartmentalize things in my brain. And so this worked really well for me. And I could see me breaking each of the 3 areas into even more pieces. So that's it for me.
Absolutely. Like I bunched intellectual and creative together, but you could break these down in different ways. And let me see. I think having many different ways to view myself is always helpful. It keeps me aware and focused. And I'm also thinking of how time management can work with the circle, how to balance the 3 regions. Terrific thought. It's a challenge, I think, because it's a way of admitting to yourself certain things that you tend to avoid thinking about. Yes. In my case, for example, that I don't pay that much attention to my physical condition. Mm-hmm. Yes, when you have it right in front of you, you can't really avoid looking at what it is you do, either to move something forward or to resist it. The questions are good ways to focus on now when your mind wanders toward negativity. Very good point. Expanding beyond what we normally do is also really important. Yeah. Yes, and particularly in terms of the focus of this conference, in our aging years, it is very important. How do we make sure that we are as alive as possible every minute that we're awake here? And so this pie is also another way to do that, to say, all right, here's something that I need and want to focus on. In a difficult position, alone, housebound, physically unable to do much in real life, but using poetry as catharsis and art to stretch myself. I'm so glad that you mentioned poetry and art. And, I do music, I compose. Any kind of creative act of manifesting what's internal to the outside, and then even possibly sharing it with other people in a relational way, is a very good way to feel our aliveness as we age. Saying in the intellectual region, I would add, have I done enough reading this week, whether poetry or fiction or nonfiction? Positive thing. Yes, it's a growth component for sure. I'd like also, just in terms of wrapping up the formal part of this, for you to say something about ideas you've gotten from listening to your aging compadres. There's been a lot of creative sharing in this session, which I'm thrilled about. And to make any comments you would like to the group as a whole about this experience and things that you may be taking away from it. Yes, a lot of creativity. Appreciate the openness with which everyone shared their processes. Absolutely. We're all blessed by that because we learn so much. I am a very great proponent, as you can probably tell, of discovery learning. I don't particularly like to lecture to people. I like people to discover things by doing stuff. And in fact, for adults, and I would say for particularly for aging adults, the learning comes by doing, not by just being passively receptive. That's why Second Life, and particularly our whole brain health world here, is so valuable because people can interact and actually try things and do things and see what comes out of that for them. Yes. I recently discovered that I'm on the autism spectrum, so socializing and even understanding myself and others has always been a problem. But at least I know now, and it's easier in SL. You're not alone. Even in this group, you are not alone with that. Cats, I'd like you to just tell people a little bit about what else they can do with us if they're interested in this way of exploring.
We have an upcoming fun version of SimMod called The Improv coming up on August 19th at 1 p.m. SL time. We also have a Visions of Self coming up soon, which is more personal and explores how we see our inner selves. We will have upcoming theater programs as well and other workshops. Also, Marley offers SimMod training in which you can get practice in helping others with this approach and learn how to help guide them through the journey without trying to interpret. If you're interested in taking part in an upcoming Visions of Self, please contact me at slcatseye2@gmail.com. I'd like to promote Marley's Visions of Self and SimMod training events. I worked with Katz, who's been in ongoing SimMod training with Marley, and I think it's a very good tool for exploring and thinking about, in a 3D way, who you are and how you relate to things. And if you haven't done it, Marley has developed this approach using models from experiential psychologies, which gets down to the nuts and bolts of what makes us who we are. And I recommend it for anyone. It's a challenge, I think, for everyone. I learned a lot. The inspiration I received from Katz working with her when we weren't in class was fantastic. All I can say is, the next symbolic modeling event that Marley does, you may want to attend, because this kind of dialogue that you develop, you learn to ask questions. You don't pinpoint people. You just learn to ask questions to help the person identify things about themselves.
Okay, I want to make a distinction between experiencing this as a client, which is what you've done today, which you can do more in a workshop that I call Visions of Self. So Visions of Self asks participants to create a self-portrait that symbolizes some aspect of themselves, either with an abstract drawing or by manipulating a photo or by doing a build, and then you get to explore them through being guided. The training is for people who work with people here, who lead groups, who teach, who do counseling or whatever. And I offer training now one person at a time or teams of people who work together on projects who think that it might be useful to have this way of gathering data for people who are wanting to learn more about their own projects or their own feeling states, their values, decisions they need to make, and so on. And in order to find out more about how you can be involved with this or when these things will happen, you can contact Katseye Tenen I turned over the mistress of ceremonies job to Katz to do the improv session we do where artists and musicians do symbolic riffs to each other's creations. Really, really fun. So I hope that some of you will come to that. Please join either WBH or join my group, Octagon Creative Exploration, to get notices about any of these programs that we're doing. As you develop your symbolic model for your life trajectory, send them to Fran, and we're going to make some kind of exhibit. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for being here. I just loved all of your contributions. They were just wonderful.